Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. And I hope everyone has had a lot of sugar to keep themselves energized for this next very exciting session. The topic of this panel that we have this afternoon is the day of the life of a successful compliance officer. And joining us on our panel are John Beeler. John is the Executive Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer for Salesforce. He's been there since 2015. Previously, he served as the company's Senior Vice President and Chief Compliance, prior to that, he was Senior Vice President of Internal Audit. And prior to Salesforce, John held finance, compliance, and internal audit leadership roles at companies such as Amgen and others. Renee Oxley. Renee is the Managing Director, ERM and Compliance Office at ATB Financial. She's responsible to oversee ATB Financial's regulatory, privacy, and anti-money laundering compliance programs. Her team provides independent oversight and guidance for managing regulatory risk, ensuring compliance, including the development and implementation of compliance assessments and controls over the organization. Darren, and Darren, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Napser. Darren is IT risk management leader for Americas and Europe with Cognizant Technology Solutions. Darren has more than 25 years of experience working in the information security, audit, and risk management disciplines. Darren has defined and implemented global compliance and risk management programs using best-of-breed tools and practices, achieving pronounced gains in key performance and risk metrics. He currently leads a team of 60 risk management professionals specializing in supply chain, ISO, M&A, and client risk management programs. Thank you, Darren. And last but certainly not the least, we have Michael Rasmussen, Chief GRC Pundit, GRC 2020 Research. Michael is an internationally recognized pundit on governance, risk, compliance, management with specific expertise on the topics of enterprise GRC, GRC technology, corporate compliance, and policy management. With over 2 decades of experience, Michael helps organizations improve GRC processes, design and implement GRC architecture, and select technologies that are effective, efficient, and agile. He is a sought-after keynote speaker, author, and advisor, and is noted as the father of GRC. So thank you so much, Michael, for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
And I'm your host and moderator for the session, Sonal Sinha, Vice President of Solutions at MetricStream. So with that, let me have the panelists provide a brief overview of their core responsibilities today. So John, starting with you, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I have a compliance function as well as an internal audit team and an ERM program reporting into my organization. So first, from a compliance standpoint, we have an HR compliance team that does a purview across the regulatory landscape of HR compliance areas that we need to comply with as an organization, and also assessing it from a risk lens. So that's kind of the first lens of the compliance team. Another lens is technology compliance. So a lot of things around certifications that you would expect a technology company to have in place, like SOC or ISO or FedRAMP, or a whole range of industry certifications to demonstrate our security competence as an organization. Another key area is our finance compliance organization, which does a lot of things such as Sarbanes-Oxley and making sure that we comply with that regulation. And then also we have a special projects arm that helps integrate all the new acquisitions that we have and helps us continue to improve our control sets across all these different areas. And then we also have an internal audit team which does operational audits across the organization and does a deep risk assessment in conjunction with a new enterprise risk management arm that we're forming that takes a look at our enterprise risks and helps coordinate activities across a compliance and risk committee that we have across the organization. That's a little bit about what we do.
Excellent. Renee?
Thank you. Well, I guess you covered most of the main areas that our compliance committee and financial covers. I've worked with the staff report at Community Anti-Money Laundering, so not only as providing guidance for the business with appropriate controls, but also the monitoring and reporting function as well to our regulators. I also have private teams, similar kind of concept, and that we do provide that oversight and governance function, as well as helping to support key processes. And they are the ones that have a customer focus, but a customer that points to deal with any significant complaints that have been raised at the corporate level. And then finally is a regulatory area, which is of course kind of a bit of a catch-all of any of the other main regulatory functions that impact the bank. And then I also have a compliance assurance group that does provide independent assurance and testing associated to our compliance framework.
Okay. Darren?
Again, my name is Darren Obsker. Our information risk management team, as an IT service provider, we provide predominantly assurance around our contract compliance with all of our clients. Also manage all of the third-party attestations that need to be accomplished. In addition, as we bring on new companies into the fold of our mix of companies, the mergers and acquisitions piece, performing the due diligence to ensure that whom we are purchasing has a good security posture. Our ISO certification program, where we provide our internal attestation around our ISO program and get that published, also resides within my span of responsibility. And then lastly, our work around, excuse me, our work around completing our internal assessments in conjunction with our internal audit group.
Thank you. Darren? Michael?
Well, my role is a little bit different. I'm not a compliance officer, but I research compliance. And so my job is to understand what's changing in your guys' roles, and as well as in other organizations out there. And three things come to mind in answering sort of how the role of the compliance officer is changing. One is that the compliance is becoming more and more of its own function in the organization. Historically, it's been a part of legal and often buried in legal. But going back a decade, ever since the Pfizer Corporate Integrity Agreement, just about a decade ago, and many things beyond them and beyond that in different deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements and things, we're seeing a big push to put compliance outside of legal. In fact, the U.S. Sentencing Commission, organizational sentencing guidelines, it's one of the things that the courts look at. Where does compliance report? Now, there are good compliance programs that report into legal, and I'm not saying that legal's a bad place for compliance. But from the idealist standpoint, the perspective is that legal's got the duty to deny and protect, while compliance has the duty to discover and fix, and these can be at odds with each other. And so more and more we're seeing that compliance is starting to separate from legal and becoming its own operational function within the organization, which means that compliance is often getting its own budgets and being more established in the organization. So that's one thing. The other thing is I see compliance being federated. Now, my job is research, and I interview a lot of compliance officers, and maybe one of you will correct me on this, but I have not met one chief compliance officer that is really responsible for all compliance. And I think we've even heard some of the answers here. I mean, compliance is very fragmented. You've got HR compliance, you've got IT compliance, like IT security compliance, you've got health and safety compliance, you have quality compliance. You've got a lot of different compliance functions. And so I see that the role of the chief compliance officer or chief ethics and compliance officer really is a federated, coordinator of compliance across the organization, as there's a lot of factions of compliance. And the third thing that I see really changing with the compliance officer's role is integrity. At the heart of what compliance is about, it is integrity of the organization. It's not just regulatory compliance, it's compliance to the values and ethics, the code of conduct, corporate social responsibility statements, the internal policies of the organization. If we look at the official definition of GRC as found in the OSEG capability model, GRC capability model, GRC is the integrated capability to reliably achieve objectives, that's the governance function, while addressing uncertainty, that's risk management, and finally, act with integrity. That's the compliance piece. And to me, that's where compliance is starting to evolve and become more of. It's not just about checking check boxes for regulations to make sure we get our get out of jail free card because we did this, this, and this, but making sure that we have the integrity of the organization in mind, that we're living up to our values and ethics, as well as regulatory and other obligations of the organization.
Right. And that's a very interesting, point that you made there, Michael, kind of leading to this idea between just having a compliance program and compliance and ethics program, right? How do you measure the culture of ethics and compliance in your organization? And, what are some of the quantitative and qualitative ways that, I'll start with you, John, if that's all right, ways that you are able to do that?
Sure. So in terms of our ethics program, just to talk a little bit more about our organization, in the past I've always reported into legal, and our organization has. Right now we are not, but we've kind of went back and forth between legals, so we are in a separate organization now. And so all the things around our integrity programs and our ethics program are in a separate group within our legal function. Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of training and all kinds of other measurements that are happening in that space. So within our space around kind of the HR, technology, and financial areas, we're tracking all kinds of quantitative measures that you would expect around training hours, the number of people participating in training, things like the number of deficiencies and all those kinds of things, number of controls that we have in our programs. But there's also a lot of qualitative discussions go around in terms of like stoplights around how effective programs are or how we're doing on our programs. So whether it be from, is this certification going properly at this point in time? There's obviously a lot of quantitative data that influences those items, but there is a lot of qualitative aspects as well. I think also some of it comes through discussions that you have. Like, for instance, we have a compliance and risk committee that's kind of a big foundation of our program at Salesforce, where we have executives across the company that talk through and have a lot of dialogue around the risks and compliance areas that we're facing in the company, and talking through how do we improve those programs, what are some areas of risk, and how are we mitigating those items. So I think those qualitative discussions and qualitative measures are sometimes just as important and really kind of feed into the overall dialogue about how we get better.
Absolutely. And measuring this, I know how numbers driven, your culture is. So definitely measuring that and monitoring that on an ongoing basis is really key.
And we're in the middle of a implementation of a GRC suite right now that we really want to take that kind of manual measurement that we're having to do today, get rid of that, and actually rely upon the system to take all these different feeds of data and create those measurements and reporting for us.
Absolutely.
Less manual. I'm sure we have some systems now, but we just really want to get out of the manual business as much as we can.
Absolutely. And continuing from that, Renee, from your perspective, when you're dealing with AML and other compliance regulations, can you talk to how you're leveraging your training programs to continue to support that culture of compliance?
To target different areas depending on what we're seeing from a monitoring perspective, areas of risk across the organization. So there are standard compliance training that people must do every single year, whether it relates to code of conduct and ethics, whether it relates to AML and risks associated there, privacy. We also do, and as regulations are changing, we monitor to say, okay, what can we do from an awareness perspective and embed that in the tool as well. And it's fully automated, rolled out with
Thank you. Darren, anything to add to that?
Well, I would like to go back and kind of echo something that John said. In a previous role, one of the most successful experiences I've had in really moving the ball forward from a compliance perspective was exactly that. It was a conversation that we set up, so we knew we had some issues with our overall IT compliance, and there was a decision made that we needed to make some very core investments. And how we went about that was in a very similar fashion, in that we set up a steering group that had representation from IT, had representation from compliance, had representation from the business owners, and then collectively made decisions around, okay, how are we going to drive these capital investments that we want to make, and what are the opportunity costs of those investments? Prior to that, our IT compliance function had reported into the CIO. Well, he was not properly incentivized to ensure IT compliance. He's a CIO. His job is to deliver functionality. And so we kind of continued to run up against, hey, we'll get to that after the next, 1.0 release of that next big application. And so after about 18 months of struggling through that, Chief General Counsel, in conjunction with the global CIO, came together and made that decision. And the amount of progress we were able to make in such a short amount of time was really impressive. And I think what really drove that was exactly what John said, having almost a conversation with all of the stakeholder parties, and then driving towards successful implementation of what we needed to accomplish.
Absolutely, and that definitely does make sense, aligning objectives to the right functions, right? To make sure that the programs are managed at the right place. So that definitely does align. Michael, from your perspective, have you seen correlation between culture and organizational setup and structure within compliance, or are there any other thoughts that you'd like to add?
Well, I'd love to see an overall integrity score for the organization, however we roll that up. But there's lots of ways to measure, the culture of compliance, and I think one is even just employee surveys themselves. I mean, what's the general feel? Do the employees feel that the organization is an organization of integrity? Do you feel that it meets its obligations? And just finding out just the culture directly from the employees and getting that, information from an employee survey. There's a lot of other metrics and data that can contribute to this. Obviously the issues and incidents and cases, investigations, and non-compliant situations, and being able to tally those. Bringing in like policies and overall understanding of policies, and the currency of policies and how out of date they are. Are policies current with regulatory changes and the volume of regulatory change? But even on the areas of like incident and case management, getting down to specific metrics from a bad thing happened in the organization at a specific date and time, and later on it was reported at this date and time. Further on, it was resolved and investigated, and even finding out what are those windows at the times. Maybe a year ago on harassment and discrimination type cases, there was a 90-day window, and all of a sudden it's down to a 45-day window between when that issue happened to when it was reported. Because people are becoming more aware that they can report, and they are reporting, that could be a good indicator there. Not just the overall time of investigation, but some of those different phases of when an issue happened to when it was reported to when it was, investigated and resolved. So I think there's a variety of metrics that can come in to help improve a compliance program and find out what's happening. And we want to make sure that people are using things like the hotline and that they are reporting, and what's the stats on that. And there's some level of some of these metrics that, even though they might seem negative, we want to see some metrics because that means it's being used and people are aware of it. When we have zeros on things, it might be because either people are scared to report, or they don't know that they can report or where to report. And so it's good to see some use, but also not too much. We're having too many incidents.
I just add to that is when organizations look at ethics and compliance scores, a lot of times we look internally into our organization and what are our employees saying, about us, what are the cases that are coming in from internally. But one of the most important metrics that we could look at are what are our customers saying, what are our vendors and partners saying, right, suppliers saying, because those metrics from outward in can also help identify, where on that ethics scale, you might be, and how much further do you have to go to continue to foster that culture of compliance. So just to add to that. And for our audience, we would love to make this more interactive. So if you do have questions, don't feel like you're compelled to hold off to the end of the session. Please feel free to raise your hands if you have any questions, as we go through these discussion topics as well. So moving on, changes in laws and regulations, and especially looking at on this panel, a lot of you deal with global legal and regulatory changes, different countries where you're doing businesses. What are some of the challenges that you face managing those changes in laws and regulations, and how do you keep on top of that? So Renee, if I could start with you over there.
ATD Financial is a little bit different than the other companies represented here. We are only Alberta-based, so we don't have the global reach that other organizations do. However, and I don't miss that headache. I don't know how to say. I can't lie. I don't miss that headache at all. But even just the pace of change in the high regulatory environment as an FI that we operate in, the change is given. The only thing that is guaranteed is that things will continue to change. So our process around regulatory monitoring, actually, we are implementing part of the DRC flow within the stream compliance. We have not done regulatory change management, but we do, like a lot of organizations, that we monitor, we have trackers, have spreadsheets. But there is a lot of that monitoring and awareness and communication, and it just keeps on going.
And did you bring in your cross-functional teams to evaluate those changes as well?
Yeah, so we do have across the group, as regulatory changes monitored, yes, it would have different SPs or subject matter experts look at that for impact. Then we map as where in the organization the fit, and then we engage with the stakeholders and look at it from the perspective of is something that would require system change, is this something that we need to change process, edit business processes, and go from there. I think we also monitor from the perspective of new initiatives. ATD is definitely undergoing a transformation in terms of really engaging a lot with extra product development, like many other FIs are. And so those new initiatives we are part of as well from the outset, so that we can be part of those discussions around strategy and what we can do from a regulatory perspective as well, and what would impact our business processes to serve clients.
Thank you so much, Renee. And John, I'm sure it's not an easy task having to, as Salesforce is growing so exponentially and is serving a whole host of customers in different industries. So, how do you manage this challenge in your organization?
Yeah, I think a lot of it are the things that Renee just highlighted. I mean, there's all kinds of trackers that you have. There's also a lot of time spent talking with other consultants and obviously depending on the topic with legal firms and dialoguing with them and understanding what impacts there are. I think also there's discussions that are had at conferences like this, right? I mean, these are the benefits of getting together with groups of individuals from different companies, from different industries, to actually have those discussions and really think and meet up with people, and you can kind of have offline discussions around those topics as well. So, I think there's just lots of different avenues to explore when you're investigating these kinds of things, and there's not like one size fits all or one answer that works best.
Absolutely. Darren, kind of putting that geopolitical, spin on this, and especially in these times, right, that we live in. Any advice or ideas from your side and how you support your customers as well as internally in managing laws and regulations? Well,
I think with regards to laws and regulations, one thing we do is keep a really close eye on our contract management system. New deals are happening all the time, and we want to make sure that we have a good visibility into what's coming into our organization, and we've got that teed up very nicely as far as understanding, some of our deals, it's 6 to 9 months before, from the time we execute until the time we take over operations. So it gives us a lot of lead time to make sure that we're well positioned. And then also, just simply, we've got good outside counsel. Having a scheduled either biannual or quarterly meeting with outside counsel to make sure that you have a good understanding of what they're seeing in the regulatory landscape, I think is really important.
Thank you, Darren. And Michael?
So specifically, what's the question right now?
So the question is around how do organizations, or how should organizations manage changes in laws and regulations and monitor them?
Yeah. Well, the biggest single greatest challenge that we have in GRC is keeping up with change, and that's dealing with the volume of regulatory change as well as risk change and business change. If you look at regulatory change specifically, go using some Thomson Reuters numbers, 2008 there was 8,704 changes to laws, rules, regulations, enforcement actions, administrative decisions and such, impacting financial services firms globally, and that was 2008. It's gone up every year. 2015 was over 50,000 changes. Global financial services firms are dealing with 197 regulatory change events every business day. That's significant. And it's not just changing regulations, but changing laws, changing enforcement of those. There's all that aspect of it. But we can hire a whole army of compliance professionals, and we can be intelligent inside and out about regulatory change, but that doesn't make us compliant, because the business might be changing in the back end, which means we're non-compliant. That employee that just came in wasn't aware of the policy, wasn't trained properly, that compliance assessment wasn't done. And so we need to keep all this change in sync. As regulations change, we need to keep that in sync with the business change, and that's the particular greatest challenge, is managing all that change and syncing that change together. And that's where technology comes in to help automate that, to be able to make sure that things aren't getting missed. And trying to do this in documents, spreadsheets, and emails, to me, is just a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And, to your point around that linkage, right, how does that change in law impact, your process and control or your risk? And managing that relationship and being able to track that all the way through, your products and your third parties, to your point, Darren, right? So those are important aspects to remember as well.
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate on that one. Working in a silo around all these kinds of things, there's just no way you can do it, right? You have to extend within the community, within your organization, getting all the right teams together and working together with them, because if you try to do this in a back office kind of mentality, it's just no way.
Yeah, and I'm sure many of you today have employees all over the world, so we're even, have to work even in a less of a silo, if I could put it that way, than we did 40 years ago. Thank you. I think we have a question in the audience.
Hi.
Navalto, can we get you a mic? Can you come up here? We'll get you a mic so everyone can hear you.
Thanks. Hi. So I was thinking about interpretation, right? So I know that a compliance officer has to read these rules and regulations. They have to interpret those rules, understand how it applies to the organization, provide advice and guidance to the business in how to comply. So how do you struggle with, in your interpretation versus regulator expectation, right? So I guess, I don't know, that you can say that some of that comes with experience, or there has to be some ongoing dialogue with your regulators to understand what the expectation is, and some regulators probably hold you to a very high standard, and others, might not. So how do you kind of struggle with that, and how do you deal with it?
So my approach to that's always been, multiple data sources. So I try to source as much of interpretation about a given regulatory change or an upcoming piece of legislation. And the more that I get the same result set or the same interpretation, the higher my confidence level is that, okay, I have a very solid interpretation. So I try to spend a lot of time making sure that we really do our due diligence and understand what that commitment is, because overcompliance equals, additional cost that your organization may not want to incur under, obviously, and under compliance, put you in a situation where you may have, a non-compliance issue where you'll have a regulatory penalty or a potential fine or a contract penalty. So I look at it as simply, use multiple sources, use outside counsel, use people that are working more closely with that and within your community that have had exposure to it. Have conversations with them around how they're doing. I spend a lot of time going, like next Thursday, I'll be at I live in Tampa, Florida, I'll be at our CISO roundtable, which is, and a lot of that conversation next week is going to be around regulatory expectations. So it helps you to build a perception of what needs to get done.
I lead finance and accounting by background, so I really understand that concern. People in the regulatory group are lawyers by background, but part of it too is that when we're assessing it, we're always focusing on the risk first in terms of assessing these changes, and then we also have an internal legal department that if we have question marks around, if we're concerned about what that implementation would look like of the change and what that interpretation means to ACD. I think that, Darren said it right, you can't, it's not just one source. You don't just read it and say, okay, that this is it, and that's why you want to do anything else. I mean, generally speaking, that you have this document out there around what proposed regulatory change is. My one complaint, I would say, from Canada, well, I have many, but one of my complaints would be that oftentimes guidance is too little too late. They provide us a lot of guidance. For example, with interactive with changes, you have changes coming and are expected to be fully compliant and have processes in place, and they're kind enough to provide guidance document before the effective date, if you're lucky. So, if you do have to engage with your counterparts, you do need to engage with external or internal legal, and as much as possible, you do your homework and document.
It's an excellent question. I mean, there's a lot of different perspectives that have to come into play here. I mean, the biggest thing is monitoring the environment, because you might have a regulation that was just passed, but that doesn't mean it's all going to be enforced right away. And so what are the regulators going to be focusing on, and what's my risk exposure there to put the most effort there, as opposed to maybe other elements of the law which are still there, or the regulation, which are clearly there, but maybe they're not going to be focused on. Earlier in another presentation, I mentioned FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I mean, you can divide FCPA up into the thou shalt not, commit bribes and be corrupt type section, but then there's also the section on the books and records and internal control provisions. For the first few decades of FCPA, the internal controls and books and records provisions weren't even cited in the cases. It was all, the you shouldn't be bribing and being corrupt provision. So what are the regulators focusing on? But you can't just, figure that out once and just go to sleep, because it changes. It's a moving target. Because now you see the books and records internal control provisions used frequently. And so you need to monitor the enforcement environment and what the regulators are stating and even forecasting, and even some of their speeches, what they're going to be shifting and looking towards. And it also impacts what area of the world you're in. I mean, here in the United States, we're very much a rules-based or checkbox-based compliance program. Here's what you have to do when you do all this and you get your get-out-of-jail-free card. Well, other parts of the world, like particularly over in the United Kingdom, as well as the EU, with the EU's better regulatory policy, you've got outcome or principles-based regulation. They're not going to tell you exactly what you have to do. They're going to have to tell you what you have to achieve. Now, the way one organization achieves that might be a different way that another organization does. But the results are what they're focusing on. And it's a much more risk-based approach. And that makes it more complicated.
Well, I think, and just to add to that, I think there's one thing that sometimes we don't consider is that regulators are also susceptible to changes in the threat landscape or the events that will change their focus. And I think it's very important, again, to have those external conversations to make sure that you get a good view as to, what's changed over the last 12, 18 months with how they're approaching certain work because of, and Target's always cited as the event, right? That's for in the IT security space, that was a watershed event, changed a lot of people's thinking, and it impacts how regulators, external parties are going to assess.
Good question. We have another one at the back. If you have a real loud voice.
How loud is my voice?
Sounds good.
Okay, so earlier we were talking about, to a degree, how staff surveys they can measure, how staff do integrity. You're also mentioning the hotline and how well it's being used. We're a new, small organization. We are very culturally collaborative and use it. And as we're integrating our compliance program, it seems to be in tension with the collective of the distributed environment. So I was wondering about retaining communications and brand building for compliance within an organization so that these things are not in tension with the actually communicating.
John, would you like to take that?
Yeah, it's not actually in my area, but I mean, we do a lot of, I think, great things as a company in this space. I mean, we have these just simple things like we have these TV monitors, throughout the company, and we have little snippets around our integrity program and just giving people guidance about where to go for information and things like that. In terms of like the training and stuff like that, it's not the boring training just going rule by rule, but it's really focused on giving some examples and having some interactions and kind of use cases where people role play, and it's a lot more effective, and I think it really ingrains the points a lot more, and we rotate what those points are. As opposed to just doing the same ones, every 6 months, after every 6 months. So, and then it's just building out additional courses and use cases beyond kind of the overall one that kind of really gets at certain targeted areas, whether it be FCPA or things like that. So I think it's just kind of providing those snippets like that, as opposed to just kind of the, one shot fits all.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead, Renee. Yeah.
I would add to that too, and that it's incredibly important to make sure that as training programs develop, that they are taken from the viewpoint of their team members, because they're the ones on the front lines that are actually dealing with these issues. And so trying to make these training programs as engaging as possible from the outset is absolutely critical around ensuring that they are embraced and not just looked at a check-off exercise. For example, we just are rolling out this week some new training related to compliance with NPM requirements, and it's actually been done as days.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of gamification, right, of compliance.
Yeah, we do that.
And we're doing that as well with our refresh around our AML training and things like that. So the more engaging you can make it, absolutely you'll build that brand and you will have buy-in.
And also kind of going back to the metrics and monitoring, where you've had some challenges in the past or where you see certain investigations popping up. I think a best practice obviously is then to leverage what all those trends are, and then that's the ones that you focus on more in terms of your drill down training and use case training around those areas.
And that's something we've done as well. So we spent a lot of time defining our risk frame and what our methodology would look like. And then those areas or activities that bubble up to the top that posed the greatest level of risk to us as an organization, we've stepped up our awareness programs for those areas so that, we have our baseline program that we want everyone to go through. But then above that, we want people that are working in higher risk areas, they're going to have more training than those that are in others. And so we've implemented that, and it's produced some very tangible results.
To me, it's stepping back in managing an overall compliance program and seeing the different avenues of communications and planning for it. So maybe in month one, we're going to communicate the code of conduct and other relevant policies and gather attestations. Month two, we're going to put everybody through some type of training course. Month 3, the CEO is going to, discuss, compliance and ethics at the at the company meeting. Month 4, we're going to put, posters up in tabletop tents in the cafeteria talking about compliance and ethics. Then after that, we might do, a gamification element, and being able to continually remind people through different ways and avenues, not just the same way. I mean, might be a staff meeting. So one month we have all managers discuss compliance and ethics in their staff meeting, and then they document, the interactions they got on it and whatever system it is. And that's where technology comes in to help enable all that, because we have all these different tasks that need to get completed, and we want to make sure they're completed and followed up on.
One thing that I did in a prior life when I was actually responsible for rolling out a code of conduct or integrities manual is we didn't have like legal or compliance professionals in each of the locations that we did our business in. And so we kind of created this concept of a compliance and integrity liaison. And we had some better title than that. I can't remember exactly what they were called, but it was catchier than that. But we basically put them through a little bit more training than we would the average employee. And then they could actually host like focus groups or roundtables, or they would actually do some of the in-person training for us in those locations. And so, a lot of companies, you just don't have the budgets to have those resources in every group, but it's also a way to kind of get some camaraderie around this very important topic that really helps define what your culture is all about. If you have you obviously want to have a very a culture based upon integrity, right? It's really hard to have a good culture without that. So I think it's a really good way to kind of get people focused and engaged.
A lot of it's definitely employee engagement. I do a lot of GRC illustrations for OSEG, the Open Compliance and Ethics Group, sort of the design and layout of the OSEG GRC illustrations. I did the artwork for many of them. I'm sure some of you have seen those. But one of the ones I did a couple of years ago was engaging employees on policies. And I'm happy to forward that to anybody, but I get questions on that every month, like who delivers this technologically? But it's all about engaging employees by having that policy portal where, I've got the policy and it's not just a PDF document there, but it's HTML and I can like hover over text and see a definition or, training. Every month I'm getting questions from organizations. It's like, why do we have to have a separate LMS system? And like all of a sudden somebody reads the policy and they have to go out to this completely other system for training. I'm getting questions because organizations are saying our employees use Facebook. They can watch a YouTube video in Facebook. Why can't people watch the policy training right there in the same portal that has the policy right there in the same experience? And have the corporate avatar out there with, my picture. And then if I read the code of conduct, signed the code of conduct, went through the training and answered the questions right, I get my, code of conduct merit badge or my health and safety merit badge or whatever it might be. I had one company asked me, and I put it in this illustration too, where there's a little light in the corner. Have a question? Ask us. Their whole concept was, this is an international ad agency of 50,000 users, but they said, our employees, they go out and go shopping on the internet, and all they get the little pop-up saying, can we help you? Do you have a question? Say, why can't that happen in our policy portal? If the subject matter expert's at the desk, a little green light's there, and you can ask them a question on the policy.
Right. So that they can put a thumbs up or a thumbs down, right, on the policy.
Yeah.
I know we're kind of heading towards the end of our time here, but I wanted to ask, one question. When we look at your background, being a successful compliance officer, we see a lot of, folks who have a legal background, of course, audit, right, IT, etc. What is the formula, right? Is there a formula? And secondly, as you think about, the trends and what the next generation of GRC is going to be, what are some of the areas that you, are investigating into, whether it be predictive analytics or artificial intelligence? Have you, thought about how data can help reduce the cost of compliance? So, Renee, would you like to start here?
That was a long one. Okay, so background and skill sets. Yeah, I'm a story marketer today, and I can say that my background has been really internal audit and external audit. I've been financial reporting, I've done stocks. Like it's one of those I think the more you have experience, prepares you for these. Because you can't just when I was first supposed to move into compliance, the first thing I thought is, well, I'm an accountant. That's probably not. You want an accountant leading your legal and regulatory compliance functions. But the truth is, process, controls are controls. It doesn't matter if it's regulatory risk, financial risk, or otherwise. And I think that the most that background in audit, especially, and being through equity risk, I guess, is what has been real successful for in my team. And then I guess next steps, sort of we focused on, really the biggest thing for me is right now really preparing for auditing, like leading our years in implementation. Actually one of the gentlemen on our team who leads years for all of APs is also here, Will, at the conference. But I think it's about having that holistic view of data to allow us to track better, make smarter decisions, ensure compliance. It's all those hand in hand. They're not siloed,
Right.
and they should be together. So yeah, being able to pull all of that data into one source and have a holistic view on risk is definitely where we're focused and starting.
Thank you so much, Renee. Well said. John?
Yeah, we actually have a pretty similar background. I started out as a CPA and got my undergraduate in accounting, and it kind of moved around between financial roles and compliance and audit roles. So, no, I think it's a very broad skill set, just like any other occupation, right? I think having intellectual curiosity is always important, an analytical mindset to assess the data and the trends. Always wanting to learn something new, right? I mean, you can't be in this field or any other field and be successful unless you're really ambitious and wanting to continue to learn, no matter what level you're at or what your expertise is. So I think that's super important. I think the idea of auditors or accountants or compliance people like kind of being in their own little function, that is absolutely definitely not a secret of success. It is a secret of failure, right? You have to get around and you have to talk to people. You have to more and more communicate what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. And I say with compliance, I think there's a ton of opportunities too. It's really about helping your company position from a strategic lens around compliance and not just thinking about it as, oh, this is going to get us, right? But it's that kind of opportunity lens that comes with it too. And so with that, because there are a lot of problems and there's a lot of risk with it, I think having a sense of optimism and hope is, I think, important as well too, because you can kind of get drugged down in terms of these are problems, right? So that's some thinking that I have around like skill sets. I think it's like any skill or any role, you have to have a broad array of skills, and it kind of goes from a strategic lens all the way into kind of some detail layers as well too.
Excellent. So ability to meditate is on that scale.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we have meditation spaces at our offices, and yeah, we would like to use them more. But that's a good concept, though.
Darren, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I've run 3 global programs, and to distill it down to the core essence of what it is, you essentially have 3 problems. You have your known knowns, you have your known unknowns, and you have your unknown unknowns. And you have to have an approach to deal with all 3 of those, right? So your known knowns are, hey, we've got these assessments coming up, they need to be done. I've got to make the trains run on time to satisfy these requirements. And your known unknowns are, things that we have scarce resources, we can't look at everything, but we have a pretty good picture of what's going on in maybe some of those lesser risk profile areas, and we're okay with not looking at them. And then the ones that keep you up at night are the unknown unknowns. And in my experience, every time when, that I cringed or there was a serious problem in an area, it was always those unknowns. And having a focus on how you methodically work through those and go through that discovery is very important as you set up your program. So it is that intellectual curiosity to say, okay, I'm going to continue to push the boundaries of what I'm doing. I have a charter, and that's great, but I want my program to go beyond that in a way that we are really effectively managing risk. So
Right.
in my experience, that's always been, looking at the problems in that context is always stepping outside the technology, the regulation. It's thinking about it in the simplest terms and then starting to methodically work the problem is how you become successful with your compliance or risk management program.
Thank you, Darren. And Michael, when you look into your glass ball, right, and the kind of technology and data we need to use as compliance professionals to be able to get better, better results and reduce cost and effort of compliance and manage our risk better, what do you see as trends in the market space?
Certainly, but I'd like to answer the first question just really quickly.
Please.
I mean, as far as skill sets, for the compliance officer, to me, it's being a collaborator, a communicator, and facilitator is what it comes down to. There, short answer for that one. But as far as technology, a lot of interesting things. I mean, a big one to me is mobility. Being able to use mobile devices on multiple fronts. One is, for the employee-facing communications, to have tablet devices to be that, policy and training kiosk. I've seen this a lot in retail, for example, where employees don't have computers. But how can we implement a tablet device to be that policy and training kiosk that can go around from employee to employee, and they can read the policies, play the games, do the attestation, go through the training and all that on tablet devices. I've seen questions on how do we use tablet devices and mobile devices to manage assessments, going out and doing branch audits in financial services or retail store audits, and being able to use tablet devices to go out and do compliance assessments in these locations, to use tablets and things for investigations and case management, to actually even use the integrated audio and video to record interviews and things. So mobility is a big factor there. And seen really interesting things like even with geolocation, so that if I'm in life sciences and I normally operate here, but then all of a sudden I go over to one of the European manufacturing facilities, it picks that up and says, we just saw that you entered XYZ plant. Here's the policies you need to be aware of in this plant, and before you enter, you have got to take this training before you go out on the manufacturing floor and be able to use geolocation elements like that. So there's that element. I also see a lot of interest in artificial intelligence and cognitive computing for regulatory change management and being able to parse regulations and identify what's changed in regulations and help provide some intelligence on what that means and automate that process. At least significantly reduce the amount of time. I don't think we're going to take the human interaction out of that completely. We need human intelligence still, but using artificial intelligence to help do some of the legwork.
Excellent. Well, we're a little bit over time, but I hope this was very helpful for the audience, and to our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much for being a part of this session, and we look forward to spending the next day and a half with you. Thank you again. Thank you all.